Hello and welcome back to Pursuit Student Ministries. We're continuing our series through classical apologetics, and today we're going to talk about prophecy. So we've spent some time already talking about naturalism and supernaturalism. So our definition for apologetics is just being able to say what you believe and why you believe it. And then I just want to remind you, our definition for naturalism is the belief that everything happens based on natural causes alone, and that supernatural things do not exist. So we have established, or I have established, I hope, that we as Christians are not naturalists. We believe that supernatural things happen, that supernatural beings exist. Indeed, that there are things about us that are supernatural. They don't necessarily have to adhere to or abide by the laws of physics, the laws of gravity, things like that. So we've talked about how God breaks the laws of nature, which he wrote himself, in order to show off his awesomeness and to do specific things for his people. But our prophecies, truly supernatural. So we're going to talk about that distinction. Just real quick to get a definition of what we're going to consider prophecy. Prophecy is a prediction that a specific thing will take place in the future. So what are some prophecies that you know of that are in the Bible that make predictions about the future? Things that are maybe they've already been fulfilled, or things that have not yet been fulfilled. When I think of things that have been fulfilled, my eyes go straight to prophecies about the person and work of Christ, conditions of his birth and his life and his death, burial, resurrection. And then when I think of things that have not yet been fulfilled, that's where things get kind of confusing. I go to the book of Revelation and I go, wait, hang on, how much of this am I supposed to be interpreting literally, and how much is supposed to be, word pictures about exposing how great God is? So we have kind of a lengthy text today, Psalm 22, verses 1 through 18. I'm going to read it, and then I'll kind of talk about why it is that I chose this text. So Psalm 22, starting in verse 1, and pay attention because this first line is going to hopefully sound familiar. My God, why have you forsaken me? Well, hang on. Where have I heard that before? Christ says that when he's on the cross. Now, the Psalms didn't have numbers. It's not like there was Psalm 1 and Psalm 22 and Psalm 147 or whatever. But the way that you would indicate the title of a psalm was by its first line. So when Jesus is on the cross, he calls attention to this passage. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? From the words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, for dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So that's as far as we'll go. And hopefully you'll notice that there are some things that Jesus is calling people's attention to when he's on the cross. He speaks this line, and when he says it, it's like saying the title of a song. It's like giving, usually in a song you have a line either from the chorus or maybe from, maybe the very first words of a song act as that song's title. And when you say that title, it calls to mind the entire song. Jesus is on the cross. All of these word pictures are already being fulfilled in what's been going on. So imagine that you're a person who has put Christ on the cross. You're very familiar with the book of Psalms. You're very familiar with the poetry, even the prophecy and the law that comes to you from the Old Testament. And you hear him say this line and you go, uh-oh. Like, I know what he's talking about, and I've seen all of these things manifest. They've all shown up in who he is and what he's been about. So we have all these prophecies, and I want to talk about this word impossible, because I think a lot of times we kind of mix up what it is that we mean when we say impossible. So is it technically impossible for all of this to have happened by chance, or is it just improbable? Okay, let's think about it this way. The Bible's about 27% prophecy. It contains a little bit more than 1,800 specific, unique predictions about the future. They're not all about Jesus. They're not all about, the death of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, anything like that. Some of them have to do with the end of the world. Some of them have to do with other events. Some of the prophecies of the Old Testament are fulfilled in the Old Testament. But you have 1,800 prophecies. Now, I can't say all of those have come true yet, because I believe that there are things that are yet to happen, and we're waiting for those things to happen, and we believe that one day they will happen. So, what do I mean when I say impossible? For something to be considered practically impossible, that's a technical term, it must have odds of 1 in every 10 to the power of 50. So that number is, 50 zeros behind it. So you have, your 1,000, your million, your billion, your trillion, quadrillion. It just keeps on going out from there. It's a very, very large number. So Jesus fulfilled at least 324 prophecies from the Torah, from the prophets, from the other Old Testament writings. So how can I make this make sense? When you flip a coin, what are the odds that you call it correctly while it's in the air? It's going to be 1 and 2, right? There's only 2 options. It's either going to be heads or it's going to be tails. So let's back up. And let's say you didn't just predict that, and you say, I predict that the next 2 coin tosses that I flip are both going to be heads. And then it comes true. Well, guess what? If you predicted that, when you made that statement, there was a 1 in 4 chance that what you said was actually going to happen the way that it did. Now, what happens if you say, I predict that the next 3 coin flips that I do are all going to be heads? What are the odds now? So 2 times 2 times 2. If you know what exponents are yet, then you probably know where I'm going with this. So for something to be considered practically impossible, it would be like flipping that coin 167 times and it coming up heads all of those times, okay? Those are the odds. I mean, you can try this. Like, see how many flips it takes you at home before you start getting them wrong. Probably, 1 or 2. The odds are really good that at 1 or 2, you're already going to be disqualified. So the idea of flipping a coin 167 times, I think that's right. I tried to do that math myself, so maybe those of you who are really good at math can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But 167 times you flip that coin and it's heads every time, then that is what you could consider practically impossible. Now, it's still not technically impossible, It's still possible by, it would go against all the laws of mathematics for someone to actually do that, but it's not technically impossible. It's just practically impossible for you to do that. And flipping a coin 167 times and calling it correctly every time is something that we would consider practically impossible. It's like, look, sure, technically it could happen, but the odds of it not happening are so gigantic that it's useless to even consider the possibility of something like that. So Jesus fulfilled at least 324 prophecies. So that's more than 167, for those of you who are good at math. 324 is more than 167. But it's actually even more amazing than that, because these prophecies aren't just like 1 out of 2 things. Like if the scripture said the Messiah that's going to come in the future will be male, it's like, okay, well, there's a 1 in 2 chance. And so today, about 4 billion people live in Asia. About, between 3 and 4 billion people live in the rest of the world. So if I were to say the Messiah is going to be an Asian male, then that's like 1 out of 4. And then I do 167 prophecies. Guess what? The prophecies about Christ are more specific than just what is his gender going to be or what continent is he going to be from, okay? They're specific in cases where you have hundreds or even thousands of alternatives in saying that, the Christ is going to come from Bethlehem. How many cities were there at the time that the Christ could have come from, even from just within Israel? It's not like it's a 1 in 2. It's either heads or tails. No, it's actually a lot less likely than that. So Jesus fulfills all these prophecies, And then we get to look back historically and say, okay, but is this really reliable? Like, when I'm reading these things, what are the odds that maybe people just wrote this stuff in later and they faked it? They faked that Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies, but it didn't actually happen. Well, fortunately for you, we've already dealt with that. And we've had a whole lesson talking about the reliability of Scripture. And we'll have one here in a little bit where we'll talk about the historicity of Christ. But I got to ask the question, is it technically impossible for Jesus to have fulfilled all of these prophecies by chance? Well, no, it's not technically impossible, but it is practically impossible. Something that is so ludicrously unlikely to happen that if you were to bet on it, you're basically betting against yourself. Is it technically impossible for someone to flip coins for the rest of their life and to predict it correctly every time? Is it technically impossible? Well, no, it's not technically impossible, but we don't function in technical impossibilities, okay? There are things that are not technically impossible that I rely on happening every day, or not happening, rather, every day. So that's not the way that we live our lives. That's not the way that we function. And then the last question, is it reasonable to assume that this was done on purpose and that it wasn't some mathematical fluke? Is it reasonable to assume that when Jesus fulfilled these prophecies, these were happening on purpose, and it's not just, if one in every, billion, trillion people is going to do this, eventually it's got to happen. Well, no, because there have not been nearly that many people to have ever lived on the surface of the planet, regardless of what your view of creation and cosmology and all of that is. So I want us to look at some specific scriptures, and I want you to kind of get a feel for this argument against prophecy, this argument that these prophecies are either, they're so vague that who knows what they could even mean, or, well, it's likely that someone eventually would wind up living and fulfilling all of these prophecies. So the first passage that we'll look at is Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. So after the fall of man, God starts to call some shots about the future. This is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. So he says, I will put enmity, so like the opposite of friendship, eneminess, between you and the woman. He's speaking to the serpent. He says, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Okay, so in what sense is this prophecy fulfilled in the future? It's like, well, that could have wound up meaning a lot of things, right? Couldn't that have meant that the Messiah was going to be a person, well, he's the son of a woman, so cool, that's everybody, and he kills a snake. So how many people throughout history have killed snakes? This prophecy is no big deal. It's not really even worth considering. Now, if you come to this from a Christian gospel-centric understanding of what's being talked about here, then you know that this is talking about the defeat of sin and the defeat of the adversary, the one who rebels against the cause of Christ. But let's get a little bit more specific. Let's think of something that's a little bit even less likely. In Hosea chapter 11. So Hosea chapter 11 also talks about kind of this idea of the origin of the Messiah, but it can be read another way, so let's see if this is even really worth considering. Hosea chapter 11, starting in verse 1, it says, Now when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So out of Egypt I called my son. And the New Testament looks at this and says, hey, this is actually a prophecy about the Christ, and the fact that Christ came out of Egypt. And interestingly enough, there's other people might say conflicting prophecies that the Christ is going to come out of Bethlehem or that the Christ is going to come out of Nazareth. This was kind of like the tradition at the time. And the whole idea is this, how likely is it how likely is it that a guy is going to come out of Egypt? Well, a lot of people were born in Egypt or lived in Egypt for a time and then came out of there. So Christ was born in Bethlehem. They fled to Egypt. He came out of Egypt. Prophecy fulfilled, but, no big deal. I mean, I came out of Florida not because I was born here, but because I've physically left the state of Florida. I also came out of Canada because I've been to Canada before and come back. So it's like if these are the types of prophecies that we're talking about and we're hinging all of this on, it's like maybe it really is no bigger of a deal than flipping a coin and saying heads and getting it correct, or saying this guy's going to be male rather than female, or he's going to be Asian rather than, European or African or whatever. But the prophecies don't end like this. The prophecies don't just hinge on, Israel came out of Egypt, so maybe this is just a historical thing, and you're saying that since Jesus physically left Egypt at one point, that's some big deal. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 7, because this is something that does not just hinge on the improbable. This is where we can actually start using the term impossible. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, reads like this: "The Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Okay, a virgin is going to give birth, and the identity of that child is going to be Emmanuel, or God with us. And it's like, maybe the name just means that, God is with us. There are other people in the Old Testament who have names that mean, the Lord is righteous, or the gift of God, or whatever it is. So maybe that's all that it means. Well, still, a virgin conceived. And a virgin conceiving is not something that's just improbable. Like, the Messiah is going to have green eyes, or the Messiah is going to have, size 11 shoes, or whatever it is. This is not just, you're rolling dice and, hey, it came up 6 and I thought it was going to come up 6. This is something that is technically impossible. Doesn't matter how many times you flip that coin, virgins don't conceive. Conception, reproduction, comes from the sexual act between a man and a woman, and the idea of that happening, the law of God being broken and going exactly against that, exactly against the law of reproduction, is impossible. Okay? The reversal of gravity, or light acting in a way that it's not accustomed to acting. Like, these are things that we don't just say is that these things are improbable. These things are impossible. You drop a pen, every time it goes down. It never goes up. So however many of you want to bet that the pen is going to float up the next time that you drop it, it's like you're betting on something that's not just improbable. Well, maybe if I drop it, 100,000 times or 1 trillion times, eventually it'll float up. No, it's impossible. It requires going directly against a physical law for a virgin to conceive and have a child. So we've exited the realm of sure, he came out of Egypt. Well, yeah, sure, he crushed the serpent. And hey, I don't know that Jesus ever actually killed a snake during his life, but he died, he defeated the adversary. If we're hinging our argument just on that, just on the idea of Christ, fulfilling those types of prophecies, I think it's still a pretty safe bet to say all of those factors put in together make a very strong case. But when you start to say things like, he's going to be born of a virgin, he's going to he's going to die and then not be dead anymore. That doesn't happen. That's not something that you say, that's really improbable that that's going to happen. Christ demonstrates the supernatural nature of his existence and his ministry through those things, through those miracles. So, last question, is it reasonable for non-believers to dismiss fulfilled prophecy as being just a coincidence? Well, could it be just a coincidence that he was born in Bethlehem and at some point in his life he exited the country of Egypt, and he also was raised in Nazareth? So it's like, could that be a coincidence? Are there other people that maybe has happened to? Maybe even in modern times, someone who was born in the city of Bethlehem and then at some point went to Egypt and then left Egypt and then he lived in Nazareth. Again, if that's all that we're talking about, then I still think that's a pretty strong case when you have 324 prophecies lined up one right after the other. But when you take into account that these prophecies directly go against the laws of nature and there is historical evidence for the accuracy of these claims, that there actually was this virgin and her name was Mary and she gave birth to a child. When we take into account all of those things, we see just the majesty and the beauty of God's plan through all this. God didn't just make some story where if people rolled the dice for long enough, they could have come up with it themselves. No, he came up with something that so put his glory on display that it would not be able to be ignored, that it would be absolutely unfathomable for people to turn their backs on this. And yet, people do. And even at the time, even during Christ's life, people saw him. We've talked about this before, how they saw him commit miracles, and they still turned their back on him. But to us has been entrusted this whole gospel with the light of who Christ is. It's the beauty of the gospel that opens our eyes. It's the hand of the Holy Spirit that grants us life to look at these things and say, I once was blind, now I see. I see this is so clearly the act of God. This is so clearly the movement of God in his people throughout history to bring about redemption for us, to stretch out his hand of salvation to the whole world and say, come to me, and then actually to snatch out of the world people for himself, because we're so rebellious and we refuse that hand. So hopefully this kind of helps you to see the beauty and the improbability and just the magnificence of the plan that God has for, yes, the life and ministry and birth and death of Christ, but also for all of history, because we're a part of this plan. This doesn't just apply to things that happened 2,000 years ago. There are prophecies that we're waiting to be fulfilled, and they sound just as impossible as the ones that have already been fulfilled in Christ. But we believe, we have faith, because that faith has been gifted to us by God. So as we look a little bit deeper into this through the questions, I hope that it helps you to understand, and not just to understand, but to really appreciate and love God more, and to be inspired to obedience because of the lengths to which he has gone to captivate a people for himself. I hope this helps you, and I look forward to seeing you next time.